Hello and Assalamu alaikum. I am Parvez Khan. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Journalism and Mass Communication, Kuhat University of Science and Technology. The subject is Communication Research Methods. The course code is GMC 481 and our today's lecture is on literature review. Before I discuss the objectives of this session, but we'll be discussing literature review in detail, but let me share the objectives of this session with you. Students will be able to understand the purpose of literature review. Students will be getting to think about their own literature review, how it will look like. It will help them in thinking, reading, and writing. This is the objective because how you can become a critical thinker, what you should read, and also with the writing. So, this session will also help them in their critical thinking process. And the last one and most important one, that the objective of this session is planning and structuring options. It will help students with how they can plan their literature review, how they can structure their options, how it can strengthen their arguments. So this is what we are trying to discuss today in our today's session. So it's going to be a very interesting one because literature review is the backbone of any research, and based on this backbone you further develop your arguments, you provide strength to your arguments, you basically stand on the shoulder of giants and then you give your own input. So let's begin. What's literature review? Well, what does it does? Where does it help you? Literature review helps in establishing the terms and context. It gives a survey of uh, preceding literature on the topic, means that whatever is done in the field of communication or the area that you're studying, it gives you a broad survey of what happened before you. Now, obviously, you will take a standing position somewhere, but what have other authors written about that position? What do key scholars in that area say about this position? Or what is the scholarly debate in the region or the area that you're exploring? So, literature review helps with that. That's a very, very important point, that it gives a survey of preceding literature on the topic and it helps you strengthen your argument that way. The next point is that it explores about the how people before you or have solved similar or somehow near the same parameters that they have explored. So it tells you to explore how others have solved similar problems or questions. Now, this is very important. Literature review is basically giving you an idea about what others have written, but it also gives you an idea. It goes further, it explores that how others have solved similar questions and problems. And importantly, when you've done with that, it provides you with perspectives and debates and the relationship of these texts to each other. Obviously, how you can see these texts is very important. What perspective is there? So, all of this can be done through literature review and it provides a broader perspective. That's the important point, that it provides a broader perspective and debates and the relationship among the text that you're studying. Obviously, if it's film studies, you are studying somewhere on cultural text, so it gives you an idea what authors before you have written about it and how important it is. So the next one is that it evaluates the quality and relevance of the literature. Like what literature review does, it gauges the quality and relevance. How else you will be able to build or reject it? Like it tells you the relevance and the quality. The more authors you study, you will find out that whether they are relevant to the area you are studying or whether they are irrelevant. So relevancy will always take place through literature review. That's what main argument is. And then it establishes the gaps or inadequacies, and obviously the purpose of research is to fill the gap, to go further, to extend the work which previous authors have done or previous scholars or previous scientists have done. Your job is to contribute and establish the gaps or inadequacies, and that's where your input comes. So if you are unable to identify gaps, it means you haven't done the good literature. You haven't contributed, because we are here as scholars to fill the gaps and extend the research further. So these are 4 5 points. Let me summarize again that it helps in establishing the terms and context, and it gives you an idea of research done before, and it explores how similar problems have been solved, and it gives you a wider perspective in debates, and it evaluates the quality and relevance of literature. So all these points are very important when you consider literature review. Now let's take a step further. What is literature review? So now let's come to the it's basically a critical analysis of existing research which highlights strengths and weaknesses of the existing research. So basically what it does, it gives you strength and weaknesses of the current research that's taking place in your discipline, in your area, or the problem under study. This is what it does. And then when you're done with this, when you have a critical understanding through, and when you know that what are the strengths and weaknesses, it gives you critical understanding of the field that is being studied. So it helps in critical understanding. Literature review will always give you a critical standing and understanding of what you're studying. So it helps basically build your critical perspective. And obviously, it makes you think what's been done, and it gives you an idea of similarities, patterns, and trends. I've highlighted these 3 words. What this literature review does, it gives you similarities, it gives you patterns and trends which you can follow, and you can extend your research by following this. And this is how it's basically an extension to the work which previous authors have done. So when you are done identifying the strengths and weaknesses, uh, you will be able to know what needs to be done in that field. It will give you a straight pathway. It will give you a mental map that which you can follow. The purpose of literature review is to make a mental map in your mind, which you can follow in future, which you can implement, you can work on. So that's why I call literature review as the backbone of any research, but because your research cannot stand without this strong, firm backbone, and this backbone includes the work done by previous scholars, authors, scientists, and it cannot happen that you just suddenly wake up and say, oh, I want to do research in this area and no one has worked on this before. It's impossible. Even if there's nothing done, similarities you can look for, previous areas that were similar to this one. So, yes, problems can be different, but there are a lot of scholarly work that needs to be followed. And then the gap is important thing. The gap in the literature is your justification for your research. So, why, while doing research at BS or master's level, I always tell you in my classes that basically what you're doing is that you're looking for a justification for your research, and that gap is your justification. And when you're doing at higher level MPhil or PhD, the same thing is that you're looking for gaps in the literature that exist. Basically, you want to contribute to a particular discipline. So that's why it's important to look into it from this perspective. So this is pretty much it. What literature review does is that it gives you similarities, patterns, and trends, and the gap you can use for your justification. So we can think about it. You can think about examples. You can, for example, if you are working on how media is portraying the refugees in Pakistan. So you can look into previous work done by other scholars. What do they say? How, for example, if there's no study before, you can see how UK is providing coverage to immigrants, or how United States is providing coverage to immigrants. And based on those studies, you can include it into yours and build your arguments based on that. And in other words, it's basically literature review is a documentation of comprehensive review of published and unpublished work from secondary sources of data which are of specific interest. So you can look into it from this perspective as well. Now, let's look into basically the diagram I can show you. Yes, so you can look into this one, that these are certain steps of literature review. You can select a topic, then you search the literature, you develop the argument, you survey the literature again, you critique the literature. The important point is that when you're done with all these steps, you critique the literature. Basically, your job is to understand scholars, and then you can write the review. Now, I was sitting with my professor, and we had a very good discussion on what literature review is. And he told me, he gave me a reference from a certain book that imagine people sitting in a room and a scholarly discussion is taking place, and suddenly you enter the room. So when you enter the room, what you do the most is that you just go there and sit down. So when you sit down, you just don't start conversing immediately. So you listen to what people are saying, what different scholars are saying, and then finally, when you're done listening to others, you give your own input. So this is what literature reviews as well. You read other scholars from the discipline, you study different scholars, you study different experts, and then finally you critique them and you write about them and you just explain what you think is the expertise, or what you think is the problem under study. So literature review basically helps in identifying how your findings compare with the existing body of knowledge. Now that's a very key point, that basically literature review, it helps you in identify and that how your findings compare with the knowledge that exists. So that's the key point. It's very important, and you should know that it helps basically identify your findings with existing body of knowledge. This is the key point. You can just read it again and understand is that it helps identifying how your knowledge findings compare with the existing body of knowledge. So how do answers to your questions compare with what others have found? And what contribution have you been able to make to the existing? So, again, I'm talking about the purpose of literature review is not that you just study different scholars and just you cite them. Now, how you build upon the work of other scholars is basically your literature review. And what is your contribution? And how your finding can be different from them. So, that's what matters the most. Now, we move on towards our next slide, and which is that there are 5 steps involved in, in conducting a literature review. The 5 steps are: search for existing literature in your area of study, the first one. Always search for the existing research. For example, if you're studying film studies, so you should read Thompson and Bordwell, you should read relevant people, relevant scholars who have done a lot of work. Even you can study, if you're studying on representation, you should study Stuart Hall. Study them. Then review the literature selected. You should always review what you have selected. You should develop a theoretical framework. Obviously, that matters. What is then also a conceptual framework, which will help you in understanding. And then you should write up the literature review. So this is how you go. The 5 steps: search for existing literature, review the literature, develop a theoretical framework, develop a conceptual framework, and then writing up the literature review. So how but let's look at for critical thinking for students. So at undergraduate level, you back up your points with appropriate and authoritative sources. You just identify who good sources are. You should use the appropriate ones. It's basically a building block for further future researches. And it's good that with our undergrad students, we try our best to make them quote relevant scholars in the field of mass communication. My priority is to give you as much strength and confidence in quoting people. For example, I was discussing representation in the class. I was very happy that some of you have a good sound knowledge of who Stuart Hall is, because he's a most key author when it comes to representation, and then obviously Marx when it comes to critical discussions, or when it comes to different scholars like Gramsci. So it's very good for me that students in our department are now familiar with key authors. At this level, if you understand who is the appropriate author, who's the key author, it will help you with MPhil and PhDs and future higher studies, in fact. So it's good that you are doing this, and this helps with critical thinking. But at master's level, I mean, at senior level or MPhil level, It demonstrates that you understand how knowledge is created. That's important. You understand how it's created, which discipline it is. It falls in critical domain, cultural domain. It's multimodal analysis. This is how you understand how this knowledge was created. And at PhD level, you demonstrate that you can create new original knowledge by giving your own input, by giving your own tools for assessment, for own tools of research. So at PhD is the highest level, and at that level, you in fact are the source of creating new original knowledge. And then obviously at professional academic level, you build a coherent body of your work and assuring others' work. So why is it important to write critically? Look, you create the first one, then you evaluate, then you analyze, then you apply, then you understand, and then you remember. So this is how basically critical thinking goes further. And another thing that needs to be kept in mind is that what needs to be done uh, after you review the literature. So after reviewing the literature, summarize what has been done, what has not been done, and what needs to be done. Now, this is a tricky sentence, but when you read other scholars, you should summarize what has been done in the field before, what has not been done in the field before, and what needs to be done. Now, when you talk about what needs to be done, basically you are referring to the research gap that exists. Now, as a scholar, as a PhD scholar, MPhil scholar, undergrad scholar, no matter which study you're doing, the purpose is to identify gap and you try to fill in that gap. So, what needs to be done is very important. Like you can say, no one has ever worked on Saraiki people in dramas, so I am looking forward to fill this gap. So, this is important. This is your input. This is a very basic example, but it explains, it gives you strength. The purpose of this class is not to give you flashy ideas about research, but to tell you that you can do it. It's not something difficult. You just need to think. Summarize what has been done, what has not been done, and what needs to be done. And always remember that you are arguing your point of why your study is important. Now, that is the key point because throughout your research, you have to give justification and you have to justify that why your study is important. Why studying Saraiki people or any ethnic region is important. Ethnic people is important. Ethnic identity is important. Why your study is important is the key to your research because you have to give justification when you're pursuing a higher research. Then pose a formal research question or state a hypothesis. Be sure this is clearly linked to your literature review. Now, your question should be linked to your literature review. For example, if you're studying on some racism and you're giving examples of racism and most recent example of George Floyd in America, how a black man was killed by police officers, and then you talk about racism in UK, you talk about the Stuart Hall's the very famous article book on the policing the crisis. You give examples from them how black migrants from West Indies were treated worse in the United Kingdom. When you give such examples and then you suddenly ask a question that how racism is taking place in Pakistani films, what kind of people or what kind of ethnic identity is facing these issues. Now, this clearly is linked to your literature review, so it gives strength. Your question should be linked. And then again, reading critically, because if you are pursuing research, reading critically is very, very important. It's the key. So, all sources cited in the literature review should be listed in the references, important point. And then a literature review should include introduction, summary, and critique of journal articles and justification of your research project. And also the hypothesis, if it's there, or question you can put up for your research project. So it's important that you include Introduction, summary, and critique of journal articles. And again, you can see I've written down the justification for your research project. That's very important. Without justification, you can't go ahead. It's important to give justification. It's very important to explain that why you're pursuing it, what's the reason, and it should come very, very clearly. And then we can say that all sources cited in the literature review should be listed in the references. And again, the slide is repeating, but again, the same thing. And you must give a brighter, very clear justification of why you're pursuing this research. So let's see, this slide just got repeated, but let's go further ahead. And just like I made a mistake, the purpose of this repetition was to tell you that mistakes takes place everywhere, and that's why you can think about common mistakes in literature review. Now, common mistakes are that review isn't logically organized. It can happen. Maybe the review wasn't logical, there was a problem with that, and maybe the focus on most important facts of the study was not there. Maybe there was a lack of focus. That's another common mistake. And then the third one is that your literature review does not relate to the study. It's something else. It's completely different. For example, you're talking about cricket in literature review, and then your study is about hockey, and how is it relevant? Or, for example, you're talking about cricket and your study is about films. So, how can it be relevant? You need to make it relevant. And then, too few references or outdated references can also be problematic. You should also study currently what's happening in the field, how people have written about it. It should not be outdated. Now, here there's a slight confusion. By outdated, we don't mean that you stop writing about the key giants of the field. For example, Althusser's writing, Althusser died long ago. And if you're quoting him, you cannot quote him from 2018. You need to cite his work from his key studies. That's okay. It's okay to quote giants because they're relevant for a long number. They're relevant for a big period of time. You can say, or they're always relevant because they are the giants of the field. You can quote them regardless of time. But for example, if there was a study done in 1980s about new technologies, now and today you're studying about social media, so it will be quite irrelevant if you're going to quote it because maybe that's outdated. So sometimes you need to look into what your study is and is it outdated or is it going to work. And then review isn't written in author's own words. It's not your own words. It's just like it seems like maybe copy paste or something. That's another common mistake. It should look like that if you've written it, it should sound that you are the one behind it. You are the one who've written it. And then another common mistake is that it looks unorganized. It's just disjointed summaries. It's not coherent. That's another problem. Your literature review must be a coherent essay. It must start from somewhere, like logically, and it should have some logical end towards it. And then review don't argue a point. That's another problem. You can write if a scholar said this, scholar said that, flash scholar said this, flash scholar said that, this and that, but it's not to the point. That's another big problem. You have to be to the point, and it should have an argument. And then review, it's not about literature review doesn't have recent references are omitted. That's already, you can have just discussed it, that you should have some focus on the recent references as well. And so these are some of the common mistakes that you need to look into. And if you look into it, it will help you avoid bigger mistakes. Now, to summarize all this, you must write logically. It must have some important facts. And the third one we can say is that it must relate to your study. It should not be outdated. It should be written in your own words. And literature review must not be disjointed summaries, and it should have an argument that you can discuss. So, think about What were the research aims of the paper or a book that you studied? Is the research aim achieved in that paper? How did they do it? Are there any problems with their methodology? Was it a strong or a weak research model? And then how will this research help with your own research? Like what you can take from it. That's the key point. Now, I've been through uh, this is important. Like, what is your takeaway? How you can benefit from it is very important. Literature review basically is like building an argument which you can present as a justification for your research, building upon other scholarly work. So that's the key point. And then, what are you doing differently and what needs to be avoided are very important. Now, we've just we just went through the discussion. It's quite a detailed one. It's quite a healthy one as well. But the questions you can look about is what is literature review, basically how it can help us in strengthening our arguments, how does it help in contributing to a particular discipline. So these are the kind of questions you can look forward to. And basically what these questions will do, it will help you map your story. Now, what is your topic? Map your story through when you mapping literature review. Who are the key scholars or people in your field? That's very important. Whenever you study, always study relevant scholars, big names, big scholars from your own discipline. And what are the key resources? Then, what are the key ideas in your field? What methodologies have been used? The next one we can say is that what are some of the strengths and weaknesses of existing research? Very important. You have to study strengths and weaknesses. Without doing this, it's useless to do and conduct further research. Now, what will your contribution be? How will it be different? What is the research gap you're trying to fill? And so, what is going to be your contribution? Now, this is how you're going to map your story. Now, planning is important as well. Like, planning is about organizing the structure of your literature review, uh, basically, how you will organize it, um, how you will organize the information. Is it going to be chronological? Is it going to be thematic? Is it going to be by trends, approaches, or techniques? So, major debates. What are the major debates, controversies? What is going on in your discipline? It's very important that what are the current debates and what are the controversies that are taking place. It also gives a lot of strength to your research. And then obviously, it can be a combination of these things, all the things, controversy, debates, trends, approaches, all these things matter a lot. So let's summarize again. Basically, literature review has four main objectives, and it surveys the literature in your chosen area of study. Is basically a synthesis. It synthesizes the information in that literature into a summary, and then it critically analyzes the information gathered by identifying gaps. That's a key point, and by showing limitations of theories and point of views, and reviewing areas of controversy. Very important when you do that. And then it also gives you, it presents basically literature in a very, very organized way. So, this is the key purpose of literature review that we are doing. It basically gives an idea. It surveys the literature in your chosen area. Then the second point, it synthesizes the information, and then it critically analyzes the information that you have gathered by identifying gaps. And final stage is that it gives you the presentation. It presents the literature in an organized way. So that's what it is. So this is pretty much the discussion that we had today. It was quite a heavy one as well, because but this is when you're talking about backbone. Obviously, you need to have an understanding of how literature review can be used. But basically, in simple words, so literature review is a scholarly work. You build your research on the scholarly work of other scientists, scholars, and then you give your own input by identifying gaps, and that's where your contribution comes in. So it's very interesting when you read scholars. Basically, you are in conversation with them, and that's the beauty of research. That when you quote big scholars, basically you have joined their company. So I hope you read more and more. The more you read, the better literature you'll have, the better relevancy you'll have. You'll be able to find themes you can work on, you can identify gaps you can work on. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the session today. Um, these are some of the references that we've used. So thank you once again. Have a very good day. See you soon. Thank you.